Next stage.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us, Han. I'll do some brief introductions for everyone. So Aaron, I met through a mutual friend. Aaron's an ex-Google engineer. He's a master when it comes to NLP. I've learned a lot about NLP through Aaron. More than that, just quite a young prodigy when it comes to all things engineering. He's building a company right now called Polka, which is they have built an incredible just core NLP engine technology that's applicable to many modern products. And their current application is a website widget to lend social proof. So it tells people what are the activities about the product, like who's looking at it, who's talking about your product, who's buying it, and it just has such a beautiful UI, so it looks great on any website. M, I know from law school. M, has ever since I've known her, she has just such an incredible work ethic. She has had an amazing career as an attorney, and now she's leaving big law to solve a really key problem that all attorneys resonate with, which is all of the pressure that goes into those long billable hours, how to maximize attorney wellness. This is a huge problem to solve, and I'm very excited that someone like M is working on it. Sean and I have had a long history. Sean and I were in law school together. We did startup law classes. We went to Silicon Valley together. We worked at firms around the same time. We are now building startups at the same time. Having known Sean, there's nothing he's more passionate about than running. So right now he's building a platform to help athletes. The idea is that they focus on performance, and the company's vision and mission is to take care of everything else on the business side. Everything from professional career growth to getting sponsorship to getting to teams. Zerzar, I know also through the Harvard Club here in San Francisco. Zerzar just went through Y Combinator. He just closed his seed round during COVID, which I think is just incredibly impressive. He brings a huge amount of resilience to his project. So Zerzar was an ex-Google product manager, and from working at big tech companies like Google, he knows just how painful some of the meetings can be. Like, people come in, they don't know what the agenda is, they don't know what the goal is. So he's really trying to solve the problem of bad meetings, which is something I think we all resonate with. Right now, his current application, his current product is to help companies going back into COVID be able to better optimize their workspaces. So like, how do you maintain social distance? And it's getting a ton of traction right now. It's a very relevant problem currently. And Han, thank you so much for joining us. I've had a couple of interactions with you, and it has just been such an incredible pleasure. I think of all the people I interact with, our interactions have the absolute lowest friction. It's like, I want to have a meeting with you, and I provide you with a whole bunch of context, and you're like, yes, and the meeting happens. So that's been an incredible pleasure.
Startup life, right? You got to make it happen.
Yeah. And every time, even your brief interactions, it has just been very rewarding for me. I think our first meeting, it was through a mutual friend. There was a dinner, and you talked about how you were reading like either one book a week or one book a day or something crazy like that. And that inspired me to start reading, which I wasn't really doing before. And that actually led into a reading club we have every week, every Saturday evening. And the second time I met up with you, you talked about the importance of building a CEO network and how that is so important to the wellness of an entrepreneur and to being able to succeed in this competitive endeavor that we're in. And that led to basically this, all of the founders coming together. So you may not realize this, but you've had influence on all of the things that we're building here today. So I think it's incredibly fitting to have you as our very first guest. So the three things I want to talk to you about today, and the format we decided to kind of shift from a roundtable discussion to more of a deep dive, is number one is surfing, number two is whale hunting, and number three is judo. So in other words, like spotting market trends and securing large customers and competing against competitors who are bigger and more well-funded than you are. And through all of this, I think you have demonstrated your mastery over just entrepreneurial leverage and being able to do all of these three things pretty well. So without further ado, and I'll leave some time at the end for everyone to sort of jump in with questions too. And if you have any questions along these lines, please jump in as well.
For sure.
So with surfing, so your long-term vision for your company is to, please correct if I'm getting this wrong, but as my understanding is to really recreate human vision on people's mobile devices or any kind of computer device, starting with being able to see the world in 3 dimensions. And having known your journey a little bit, I know that you have gone through many pivots. And that's kind of what I want to dig into a little bit. I think more than anything, the pivot that I'm most fascinated with is like this shift, that almost like a huge shift from hardware into software. So let's start with hardware. Like, how did you decide to start with hardware? Like the conventional wisdom is like hardware is hard, right? Like it's like, as you said yourself, there's a huge amount of funding that's needed, and there's very little tolerance for making mistakes, especially for a first-time founder. But what was your initial thinking going into hardware? Like where did you see the opportunity in creating that 3D camera? Why not do something more along the lines of software?
For sure. I think, to start off, to go a couple steps back, about my background, which inspired me to go after what I'm doing right now. The big vision is really to help people share their world as much as, human as possible. The way the world is becoming more digitalized, people are looking at screens. You still want to be close to someone. You still want to be able to be outside. Those kind of experiences will go away the more the pandemic is ramping up and the more social distancing becomes the norm. And so we believe that, by allowing people to create 3D experiences and then see them and feel present, even though they're physically distant, that's the most human way possible to share experiences. For me, when I started in hardware, to be honest, like every startup is hard. So that's, like, of course, some of them are hard in different ways, but I think everybody is going through the tough struggle when they start a business from scratch, that there will be challenges, and the challenges will be coming at you in different forms. Why I started with hardware, because there was no other way to create 3D content. And I looked into like very old devices which captures stereo camera imaging and stuff like that, and it just didn't, it doesn't appeal to me. How can we create easier the experience with a device? And at that time, I didn't know better, because mobile phones didn't have stereo cameras or multi cameras. So what I started doing is like, okay, then build your own, right? That's the first starting point. And you are very right, like with the pivots, but I would say there are 2 types of pivots, right? One is where you adjust your company and you shift the direction a little bit. And then the other one is like a real pivot, which means like you do a completely different thing with the remaining money you have in the bank account. And so for us, we didn't see it so much as a pivot. Our vision is still the same, but we were going after tangents. And like, I love to read a lot, but there was a book which is, they were saying like, the biggest opportunities in your life are never lying in the perspective or the view or the first look you have. It always looks at the peripheral of what you're looking at. And so that's how we saw the evolution of Lucid become. And right now we are on the mobile device, created an app, and that allows people now to capture, and everything is driven through AI. So, long story short, software and AI has really replaced the need of hardware and what we have done before.
I see. So the initial thought with going into hardware, it was just like there wasn't a good hardware device.
Yeah,
You actually
right.
had to do it.
Yeah, sometimes you have to build stuff which doesn't exist, and that's the first starting point.
I see. And when was it that you switched over to the software side? And like, how did you make that decision? Like, how did you know that that was the right timing to make the switch? Like, was there something that triggered that?
Oh, for sure. So when we first launched the camera, and we did an Indiegogo campaign, and afterwards we went into mass production and shipped thousands of units, and the first iteration was through. As you know, GoPro took 4 to 5 iterations to get it right. So in every hardware company, it's going to take at least 2 to 3 iterations to get it right. So after the first iteration, we learned so many from all our mistakes. We learned so much. We brought the camera all the way into Amazon and Best Buy. So, you know, you could walk into a Best Buy store and actually buy it. Great achievement, but it doesn't really make economical sense. So when you sit there as a founder and you're looking at your financial performance and you are looking at, I just like worked my ass off for like the last 1 to 2 years, and I've spent I raised a huge round at that time. We raised like somewhere beyond 2 million in a seed round to just all invest in that, and at the end you are left with almost no cash, and you're just like, okay, what do I do next? Because the next iteration will cost me even the same amount of money or more. Yeah. And that's where the point where you sit down and you are like, okay, I can go out there and talk to investors again, sell them on a huge vision and huge story of how this is going to take off, while every other hardware company in that space is dying. Or I can think of a smarter way of how to find a tangent where we can continue the journey, but in a much more financially positive way.
I can imagine that was such a difficult decision to make. So it sounds like, you know, it was at a point where it was very hard to proceed just because like it would take such a huge amount of investment to iterate, and it didn't quite make economic sense. But on the flip side, it was also just a lot to give up. Like you build a whole infrastructure, the product, like you said, is on Amazon, it's like being sold into the market. That was a huge amount of effort to make all of that happen and to give up all of that and pivot into software, which is quite different.
And to be honest, it was even harder, right? So I think that was the end of 2017. We were sitting there, had about 3 months of cash in the bank. What do you tell your team, right? Like when you have that decision and you're sitting there and you know like you're not going to have enough cash to go for the next iteration. A lot of investors are turning you down. They don't want to invest in that space anymore. And now you are thinking like, okay, what now? What are you going to tell your team? What are you going to tell them to stay? What are you going to tell them to continue the journey? And how do you drive a new vision where people would actually follow you to go after the next crazy?
Yeah, yeah, some very difficult conversations I think to have. So going into like the decision to go into software, like were you also exploring other directions too, or like how did you know where the next step was? Like did you figure out the next step before deciding not to proceed along the hardware route, or was it sort of like, you know, step one and then step two?
No, so I think every startup has that, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think every startup has exploration and an execution mode. That means like 90% of the time you really spend time executing on your whole idea of where you want to be, what you're building right now, and that's where you spend most of your focus on. But I'm 100% sure all of you guys have thought of how to use what you're doing right now for something else. And that just comes along the way, right? People bring it up, or some of your friends recommend it to you, or you run into a customer who would be saying, "Oh my God, that would be great if you did this," right? And so we all come across those kind of things, and probably we all go through those cycles where we touch upon them. We see like, oh, there's an opportunity, and here's an opportunity, and here's an opportunity, and then you test them out a little bit for like a day or for a week, or maybe like for 2 weeks max, but not to distract yourself too much. And then you go back to what you do day to day, right? So everybody has that. And so we had multiple conversations with, when the camera got out, larger corporations were reaching out. They were saying like, hey, what if we embedded this into devices, or what if we would live stream with this, or what if we put that into a robot or something like that, right? So those kind of explorations everybody always has. That means like, I think the most important thing as an entrepreneur is to always keep your peripheral attentive, right? Always being able to spot things in your peripheral, because often when you see those peripheral perspectives and you see those opportunities, those might be opportunities which might be worth 3 times or 5 times of what you are currently doing. And that's what we noticed, when we got into the point where we couldn't raise and we were, 3 months away from bankruptcy. We were just like, okay, let's go through some of the things which came across in the last couple of years. And we thought, like one of the most economic reasons to do it is it actually boosts drastically your cash flow and your financial performance. And so if you imagine, we started the company and we built the hardware was about like 4 to 6 people, right? After the pivot to the tangent, which we had, we were suddenly like in the 20 to 30 people. And that's on a cash position perspective, which was able to scale.
I see. So actually the company grew after the pivot.
That's
Um,
correct.
so you're exploring multiple hypotheses at any given time. You're exploring multiple directions. So it wasn't a surprise to anyone when you did pivot. Like these were ideas that were already there.
That's
Um,
correct.
but was it easy to align everyone on the new direction? Like were there people who disagreed with it and just didn't believe in the shift?
Yeah,
Or like how did you manage that?
yeah, I think it's harder to drive the people to follow you. It's not so hard to draw to get rid of your hardware, right? The piece which we draw. It's also not so hard to change your software, which we spend a couple of weeks in doing. But I think what's the hardest is to keep the people around, right? And you might have like very strong people in a certain area. When you're changing your business, you are changing your complete organization, right? So you need different talent for different directions. And that's the hardest, right? And I was lucky enough that during the pivots, we had the people who didn't see a purpose anymore or didn't see an alignment anymore. They were the ones who we actually couldn't keep later on either.
Mhm.
So that means like we didn't need to let go people. They were leaving by themselves because they saw that the new direction wouldn't align with what they're doing. So for example, previously we had a video producer, right? So because like when you are selling a camera, you have to have a lot of content. So you have in-house production team, which does all the content. But then like when we dropped the hardware and we started, focusing on embedded software, there was no necessary content creation needed, and so the person was just happy to let go and build her own production studio now, and is very successful in doing that. And yeah, we were able to part ways without necessarily creating the friction.
It sounds like to some extent, like people leaving and going due to changes in the company's direction. That's just part of the game. That's inevitable. You can't do too much as a company leader to keep everyone on board for sure.
That's correct.
Was there any strategies you used to make the transition as smooth as possible? Like, what part of it is it about just communicating the vision so that everybody understands it? What part about it is about really finding alignment with, how everyone could fit in under the new vision? Like,
Sure.
what was your approach of thinking about this transition internally with the organization?
So the first thing was like the communication about the vision never changed, right? The vision is still the same from day one. And the only thing I communicated was, we can't continue doing hardware. Hardware is not a economical friendly business, especially in the space we were in, at the price we were in, at the customer base we were in. And I communicated to them that we still want to pursue the same thing. We still have the same vision. We want to be able to bring people closer together by allowing them to create and share the, in the digital world, the most human way possible. And I told them I was just very upfront with my employees at that time. I was just I sat down with each of them and I told everyone, we have 3 months left. You are free to start exploring other options now, right? I will not hold you down from going out there and applying for other jobs. I will support you, and I will pay your salary as well as give you health insurance, and you have 3 months to find a new job. However, my vision still stays the same. And if you want to continue this journey with us, please help us in the best way possible, because we have 3 months to turn this around.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
thanks for sharing the details of the conversation. I think that level of just like being direct and honest is exactly what's needed to get the conversation either one way or the other as quickly as possible. And that's kind of what the company needs at that stage.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, I read a lot, and you asked me like what books would be great, and I was just thinking about that because one of the books I read very early in my journey was The Hard Things About Hard Things, right? And when I was reading it, I was a very newbie entrepreneur, just one week into my journey, and had no clue like how hard it's going to be, and was very optimistic about everything. And then when I read that book, how they went through layoffs and like hard conversations with the employees, I realized that's the number one thing you have to be good at: having those hard conversations with your team, and talk and being extremely honest and transparent with what's going on, because that's ultimately what's going to keep them following you, or having them leave.
Perfect. Um, so I want to kind of come back to our surfing metaphor a little bit.
Sure.
This was a story you told me that kind of stuck with me, and you talked
Yeah.
about building companies as surfing, which is a really great metaphor because like surfing is really about spotting the waves.
Right.
The technique is important, getting on the board is important, but as the person become a better and better surfer and compete at the highest level, it's like the best surfers know when the big wave is coming.
That's right.
So like, I guess it's it's a difficult question to ask because it's like, how do you become a better surfer in the entrepreneurial sense? But maybe if you can draw from your own experiences, like what made you, like you talked about how you became better at seeing the waves over time. What was different? What was different about how you thought about the trajectory of the market when you first started in hardware to how
Mm.
you saw new waves that are coming up later on as you are getting into software, as you're talking to some of the bigger customers?
For sure. I think, like, there are three things which really made the difference about becoming better in surfing. The first thing is, like, the longer you are in the water, the better you get in spotting, right? That's like for every surfer. Every surfer says that, the more time you spend in the water, the better you get a sense of how the waves are moving, right? That means, like, for people who do a startup for a year and then quit and then just let it go and then do another startup for a year and quit, they're not going to get good at it, because they're giving up too early, right? You have to spend at least 2 to 3 years to understand what's going on so you can actually catch those waves. And then the second thing, which was really good, was being thrown from the board, right? So that means, like, when you have your VC conversations or your customer conversations and they tell you your business sucks and you should stop, you should not do this, it's the best thing ever. Like, when I started turning my perspective on, like, those rejections and those kind of harsh feedback I got, I realized those were the best feedback I could get, because they have a certain degree of truth to it. And that degree of truth is up to you to filter, because of course it's not everything is true, right? But, like, there are certain degree takeaway which can make you become a better surfer, right? And that's what I mean with the waves, like slapping you from left to right. That's pretty much what happens. And then the last thing, I think, is really about when you know how to paddle and position yourself with some of the best practices, right? So I started looking into a lot of best practices. I had something similar like what you're doing here right now with my team, where I invite, like, people to come over and talk about, like, what made them successful and what took them to that stage. I noticed that after talking to so many of them, I realized there's a pattern, right? So there's always something special which they had, either as a mindset, a perspective, a principle. And that principle I started writing down into my, I call it like startup journey, diary, and then just started writing them all down. And so, like what a lot of VCs say, with best practices, you can promise that you're going to be 100% successful. But with best practices, you can optimize your chances of becoming successful. So that means, like, let's say, like, if you have the chance to succeed in startups, which is less than 1%, then at least you can bring it up to 5% if you apply some of the best practices. And that's what I started doing with my, with my portfolio of approaches I do.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, the pattern itself is very difficult to describe. Like, what does that wave look like? But it's an easier way to think about in terms of, like, what can you do to become a better pattern spotter? So you talked about, just more experience, you see more patterns and you spot them, learning from hard mistakes and talking to the best, learning from the best. Like going along the third, I guess, option, maybe you can dive into what is the next wave you're looking at now? Like what are the aspects of that next wave for you that you're looking at that tells you like this is the one to chase after?
For sure. And to be honest with you, like talking about waves, in the beginning, it's not a bad thing to start with a small wave. It's really not, right? Like if you think like you're sitting only on a small wave and everybody is like looking at a much bigger market, why am I not chasing that bigger market? Don't be frustrated, because in the beginning, the smaller waves have tangents and they lead you to the next bigger wave. And that's how we saw it for us, right? So for example, for us was building a hardware piece which captures 3D photos and then share them, right? Was great. But then like after the hardware piece, being able to embed that into mobile devices got us from thousands of devices to millions of devices. And now from here, to be able to launch an app which then everybody in the world can download, gets you to 10 million, 100 millions of devices. And that's how I saw the tangents and the bigger waves aligning, so I can actually, jump from wave to wave. You pretty much do wave hopping, if you call it this way. And that's how you get to the leap to the larger one. And the largest I have seen right now from where we are now is that everybody is starting to collect 3D data. Facebook is doing that. I think Niantic just announced that they are starting to look into collecting 3D data. Snapchat is trying to do that. Like all the companies are trying to collect 3D data around the real environment. And that's what we are ultimately sitting on, right? All the images we have created with AI is something which everybody's now also chasing after.
Very interesting. Were there any signals that turned out to be red herrings? Were there any signals that you thought was part of spotting the wave that ended up being, a false positive, I guess?
Oh, for sure. I mean, like I chase bad waves too. Right? I mean, that's not I think I spent a lot of time riding on waves which were a little small and didn't lead anywhere. However, I think I was lucky enough that those waves turned out to be bad ones early on. So that means like when you go down waves, and like I said, again, about the exploring, the 80% focus, execution and the 20% exploring. When you do the exploring, right, you will notice that some of those don't actually lead anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that exploring is necessary. Like don't stop exploring, right? Keep doing it. However, always have your focus at the right time, at the right priority. Right. And for us, I think one of the things which we explored was like, how would it be to do 3D data collection and manufacturing cameras, right? We started looking into robotics. How would it be to enable robots to collect 3D data, and then autonomous cars? There's so much, right? Like you could be just lost exploring. That's the biggest problem. But I think like even with exploring, I'm very focused and narrow. That means like, when you have your focus over here and you're exploring something, you have to focus, like when you explore, you have to dedicate a certain amount of time and resources to it, but it has to be very limited. That means like if you're able to ramp up something to go after the exploration within a couple of days, right? I'm talking about days, not weeks, not months, days. And you are able to get a validation of the market back, which proves a certain data point you are trying to make, then that's the best way of exploring, because you are validating a hypothesis outside, which then turns out to be the wrong one, and then you go after it.
I see. So do quick experiments, focused experiments to test some of these hypotheses, like whatever.
That's correct. If it takes you longer than a day, you should not do it, right? Like,
makes sense. So let's talk about whale hunting and how you landed your first customer. I think that's really what I wanted to dive into most is, not so much how you got your first 10 whales, but how did you go from 0 to 1?
right.
And from reading your earlier interviews, you talked about how you came at it almost with a really long time horizon, right? Because you were going after the Googles and the big tech companies here, and and the companies don't realize where the market is going. The startups know where the future is. And so you had preliminary talks with them a year in advance before finally securing their accounts a year later. Like, walk us through that process a little bit more. Like, what did that first initial conversation look like? And like, did you actually have like that 1 year time horizon at that time? Because I think that's really rare for startups. Like, I think most startups think in terms of like at most the next 6 months or the next 3 months. It's very rare for a startup to plan out, say like this market is going to arrive 1 year later. So I'm going to start preliminary talks right now. So yeah, like if you can talk about what was in your head then, I think that would be very interesting.
Like, who of you guys do B2B actually? Like sell to larger corporations? Like anybody? Like all of you?
A little bit.
Okay, there you go. So the funny thing about large companies is, they only realize when it's too late that they have to do what you do. Like then they come after you and they start chasing you like crazy, but they will not realize it until it is too late. So that means like when you are telling them like, oh, there's a future and like there could be this and that, like like they listen to it and they think it's cool, but then like they don't really go after it. And so the best way really is to understand when it is too late for them. Like there's many signals in the market which makes them become too late. Like for example, if another guy launches something, like let's say an Apple does this and Samsung, we talk to Samsung and Samsung sees Apple doing it, they think it's too late and then they start coming after you, right? So those are the very funny moments when you have, and you're like, I told you this 2 years ago. No, but to be honest, it's really about, again, about the exploration again, right? So we had initial talks when we launched the camera, right? And during the camera space, we thought about it already because you do think about a lot of stuff. And those kind of ideas, never let them go. Like write them down somewhere, right? I have a diary where I write everything down, like all the ideas, which could be a good tangents, but I don't pursue them. I just write them down. It doesn't take you more than a couple of seconds to do that. And then so we had conversations then, and we had a couple of conversations with larger corporations at that time, not really pursuing them. Taking a call, taking a meeting is not a big deal. And then like, when we started having only 3 months, I started going after them and I told them like, do you remember what we discussed a year ago, right? And then they're like, yes, that's correct. And then probably 80% of the rest of them, they said, no, we don't need it right now. And then there was someone else who was a first mover, and we were lucky enough to get into the first mover. And then after we had the first mover, then the other guys started becoming a little bit nervous. And then your conversations over there start moving. So that means like when you're moving, right, you have to understand where the market leverage is. And that's the same coming back about, I think surfing is going to be our main topic today. It's about how the tides are moving, right? Understanding how the tide is moving, how the wind is moving, and how the other surfers are coming into the water. That's very key to understand when you have an opportunity, a window of opportunity opening up for a big deal.
It does sound like that first whale is way harder. Like once you have the first customer, the others are much easier to get. And it also sounds like not all of it is up to you. A lot of it is what's going on with the market, with everyone else, with what's going on the customer side. So walk us through like how that first customer sale went. Like what, like in your interviews, you talked about how it's very important to understand the motivations behind the whole group of people behind a big decision at a big company, right? So like, what was their motive? Who was that customer, and what was their motivations?
Of course. So in the beginning, when you go into a large corporation and you have the first conversation, you are super excited. You think this guy is going to make the call, and then you hopefully he's going to give you money too, and he's going to write the check, and everything is going to be fine. But I realized, in an organization, there's mostly lots of stakeholders involved who will be making the decision together. And there are internal politics. You have to understand what's going on. Some of them don't have as much leverage than others. And then some of them are much more aggressive in pushing deals through. And understanding that was very important, because the same approach happens when you fundraise, And the same approach happens when you close a large deal, because you have to understand what's going on in that VC firm. You have to understand what's going on in that law firm you're trying to sell to, right? And so for me, in the beginning was I heard that from someone when I was talking to another CEO who was really good in sales, and I started mapping out the organization. I started mapping out the organization by like, okay, I always ask the question when I'm in the meeting, like, who else would be included in this project, right? Like if I sell a large project, like who else would be working with you alongside? Like, is it, like your product manager who needs to understand the market? Is it the engineering team? Is it, what is the BD team for? Like I ask like really stupid questions when I go in. And I think that's the best part, right? Don't shy away from showing them that you don't understand it, which is fine, right? I mean, sometimes you get information that are very, very helpful, and you never expected that you're going to get that information. And that's what's going to get you the deal.
I love it. So it's not just about talking about the product. It's not just talking about like their purchasing decision. It's understanding who their friends are, who do they work with, who's their boss, who's their secretary, and really understanding their world. And from there, reconstruct like what might be their motivation in coming to you to making that purchase decision.
That is correct. And I think I read a book recently about sales trends, right? The sales of our generation versus sales 10, 20 years ago. 10, 20 years ago, it was all about you selling, you talking, you just pitching and pitching and pitching. Sales has since then turned, which is becoming much more you listening and you acquiring information. So you are more, think of yourself now when you sell as more like a data acquirer than actually data presenter. And that will change your complete, the outcome of all your sales activities.
Mm-hmm. And I think that process gets easier too as you have more information, right? Like it's much easier to have a conversation about their friends if you know, oh, well, like, hey, Fred, I know, he likes golf, or whatever. Then the conversation kind of builds on itself. But initially, I think the first conversations are the most difficult because like you know nothing about them or their world. Like you don't have any context. How do you overcome like that initial awkwardness when you're approaching like a brand new customer?
That's a good question because, like I don't go into every meeting asking like, how's your friend doing? But I think, getting into the meeting, building that initial rapport is very, very important. And I think it sometimes it needs more than just one touch point to achieve that, right? Like you can have a cold call, you can have a cold meeting, and it's not going to go anywhere. But having multiple touch points is going to be very, very important. That means like touch points through, bumping into him like a year later or at a different event or stuff like that, right? So some of the best sales guys, they know everything about the person. So they know this person I'm going to meet here, and I know his friend, I know his, inner circle, and those going to talk to him. I'm going to put a reference in to those guys. So let me give you a funny sales scenario, right? So I meet a large corporation the first time, and there's like an engineering team and BD team, and they're sitting in there. BD team is always super excited. Engineers always think they can build themselves. Okay, good. Then understanding in that organization who is the decision maker. Is it the VP who's sitting in there or the senior director? And then having the BD person there and being able to understand who surrounds the senior director, do your research on LinkedIn, right? You might have like mutual connections, or you might hack yourself into mutual connections, and he will probably take advice or input or whatever from those people, and then that guy is going to speak at the next conference, so you're going to go show up at that conference. Just drop him drop in after the speech he gave and say hi and do like those kind of things. You will see that sometimes some of the best sales guys are the ones you see a lot, and you thought it was coincident, but it's not a coincidence.
I like it. Multiple touch points. How did the follow-up look like? So like, you got your first customer, they said they're going to do it. Was that the end of the story? Like, did the sale just, it went through and money got into the bank and the product went to the customer? what did it look like after the aftermath of, that first engagement, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question because yeah, the harder part is not like saying yes. It's really like being able to come to agreement where both people win, and that means like from drafting your first contract to negotiating the terms, to leading through the terms, taking concessions on some of the terms, and then really making sure where in the negotiation, where are your priorities.
Mhm,
Don't select more than 2 to 3 priorities if you go into a sales negotiation,
mhm.
and then being able to sign that contract. I think that's a tough process, right?
Yeah, I think that's where usually the lawyers come in.
That's correct. Yes.
Cool. I want to move on to talking about judo and wrestling with, people who may be bigger than us.
Yes.
And I want to talk about it separately from like big companies with, medium companies, like companies that are roughly your size, but, maybe a little bit bigger and, have more money or have a larger team. Sometimes it could be like 10x bigger, but they're still a very small company compared to us. But let's start with the big companies. So like, you talked about big companies are slow, they're risk averse. There are places that they cannot and don't want to go, frankly, right?
Yeah.
Endeavors that have uncertain payoff, that are very innovative, that frankly maybe like the rest of us entrepreneurs all think is inevitable, is going to come. Big company actually just cannot move on that.
Yeah.
So like, I guess, what are some examples in your experience where you had to compete a big company? Like, I think you mentioned about, Facebook, releasing similar products as your own software products. Like, what strategies do you use to kind of use their weight against them? Like, how do you turn these kind of weaknesses relative to startups into actionable strategies?
Right. Right. And to be honest with you, larger corporations will always come after you. So that's the number one thing you have to write down, because that's the most important thing I learned. Like if you have traction, people will always come after you. And that's why like investors always ask like, why wouldn't a Google do that? Why wouldn't a Facebook do that? And it's funny because of course they're gonna do it. If you're gonna succeed, they're gonna do it. And so funny anecdote. When we did the camera, we worked 1.5 years until the launch, right? Building it, manufacturing it, creating a huge launch event. On the same day as we launched the 180 camera, where I was told for like 2 years before that it's a shitty idea, like nobody would ever use 180, like you are wasting your life. On the same day when we launched, Google and Lenovo came out with the 180 camera. And they timed it so well. Like during our launch event, the press released on TechCrunch that Google is now doing a
Wow.
180 camera. And it was so crazy. It was mind blowing, right? I mean, like, how is like we were during the launch event, right? We had like a couple of thousand people like in the room, and we were just like giving a speech and partying and showing the camera off. And the same night, you see on TechCrunch, The Verge, like all the big media outlets, Google is launching a 180 camera. They called it VR 180. We called it 180 VR. Who cares? But the thing is, they had much more leverage than us, right? And that's always going to happen to you. And unfortunately, there's no way to avoid that except if you know judo, right? That's what I was talking about. Judo is about how do you play with those kind of larger corporations which are come after you. And what I consider under judo is, did you guys ever read the book like the Art of War? Yeah. So the Art of War, when I read the first time, I did not get it. When I read it the second time, I also didn't get it. Now I get it. Like it's really about how small teams move against larger teams, and being able to, like I think I still remember that one strategy where it's like, I think they even used it in the movie 300. They, when you have only like 10 people fighting against an army of 1,000, what do? You hide behind, like intersections so that only one person can pass, and you just kill that one person every time they pass, right? you can do actually similar moves in your startup.
What did that choke point look like in your situation?
So for us, right? I mean, like building the camera, competing on a hardware level, impossible. It's really impossible. Let's say we want to compete on a platform level. It's also impossible, right? Like building a platform, competing head to head against YouTube, impossible. But I think the only advantage you have as a startup, you sit much closer to the customer. And I think the next generation of entrepreneurs are the ones who can read data much better and closer and know how to acquire that data much more precisely than anybody else. And that's how you adjust your application, how you find out about a certain trait in the application, which other people don't see, and you go after that. And that's the only way how you can compete. And then you build out your solution towards that niche, right? Let's say, let's say we have a camera, right? On a hardware level, impossible to compete. On a platform level, impossible to compete. But then there's a certain person among our users who says like, oh, I've been mounting it on my head every day. I've been using glue to glue it to my head, and I don't know how to do this. And those kind of things are normally not widely spread. Like larger corporations don't hear about it, right? They don't hear about how it's been used, why did it break, what is going on, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you build for. Now what we came up is like a head strap, which really simple. We just took a off-the-shelf head strap, and we increased our sales by 3x, 4x, just because we listened very carefully to that feedback. And your number one question should be, it's not like who I'm going to compete with or if the big guy is going to come after me. Your number one question should be, how can I collect the most in-depth and deep information from my customers so that I can differentiate my product?
I guess if it's something that everybody is talking about, that's probably not a non-obvious insight to use against a bigger company. So it's more likely something either situational or only applies to a subset of people. I guess with this mounting on your head example, now that you have this insight and you build a product that serves this customer need, how do you then defend it? Right? You said yourself, Google is going to come after you. They're going to put a head strap. How do you make the head strap better than Google's head strap? How do you make sure Google doesn't also, just replace whatever it is that you have replaced? Or is it more about understanding the collective combinations of the customer needs?
No, so yes. So it's really not about the head strap. It's about the use case the head strap brings in. Mm-hmm. And then you start going after that niche and you start customizing everything towards that niche. If you see lots of people are using head straps and you don't know why, don't build a head strap. Sit down with those people. Mm-hmm. Have a call with them and just find out over a couple hours of why would you do that? Why would you mount it on your head? What kind of application would that bring? And what does that need? Why is it so painful to do this? And have that in-depth conversation. That's what you're gonna make. Do you guys know the lean approach, lean startup approach, where people go out and survey people and stuff like that? I love that approach. But the thing is, in the beginning, it's really harmful because everybody tells you something different. So the problem is you get 10 customers, 10 people tell you very, very different things. What are you going to go after? But if you come up with your vision, you build a product, you start testing it, you put it into the market, now you get customer feedback and use cases, and then you deep dive into that, surveying of one-on-one conversation. It can change everything. Because at that point, you have a real product which can fail and where you can learn from your failures. Before that, it could be any product.
I see. So it has to be more than just one simple feature or solution. It's really a new category of products, a new use case altogether that has all sorts of different solutions combined that it would be very difficult for a bigger company to replicate.
That's correct.
I see. So okay, let's talk about medium companies. have you competed against a company like, I think you have a team of about 40. Have you competed against a company that's a team of 100, 200, who is also in your space? Where do you see your advantages being smaller? Or maybe it's not just about being smaller, but like being more unique relative to the bigger competitor. I mean, this is a very different case because it's not a, tech giant like Google who is like, or, just have way more resources or maybe distracted on other fronts. This is another competitor that may be laser focused on your industry, and who may have a similar level of deep understanding on your customer, and who have a bit more resources than you, to build whatever solution that's needed.
For sure, and often, when you talk about to VCs about that, for example, if you have already competitor in the market who have raised a lot of capital, and then you have those head-to-head fights against others who are maybe raising faster, or they raise larger, like from SoftBank, and then they start crushing you, right? That's a very tough conversation to have, and at that time, it's really about how do I scale faster than them, right? How do I execute faster? At that point, it's really about speed. And as soon as you have a head-to-head competitor, that means your market exists, right? That means like someone else is already coming after it. So that means your market exists.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, it's shift into a different gear and start raising more capital to grow it. Because like if your market already validated and other people are coming after your market and trying to create the market as well, or pretty much eat the market, at that time, you have to compete on speed.
I see. So it's like two small armies. Whoever is faster, whoever is more maneuverable is going to win out in the end.
And who has more connections, right? I mean, at that point, it makes a huge difference. Like one of my friends founded Spoon Rocket. That's like a food delivery at the time in Berkeley when I was going to school. And there was another company, I forgot the name, but they raised like 40 million. They raised only 12 million,
mm-hmm.
and got crashed and just got eaten away, right? So, but the thing is, like, understanding how to grow faster. They did a campaign which was very successful with I think fast delivery within like a couple of minutes or something like that, or free food if we don't deliver under like 10 minutes, mm-hmm. and something like that. It's your marketing capabilities, your business capabilities, your fundraising capability, which will define the speed you have.
I see. I guess I want to talk a bit more, dive a little bit deeper on sort of almost like Judo techniques, right? Like what moves do you use, right? You talked about fundraising as like a really great move, right? Like if you can raise more capital than them, that's a great way to grow faster. Of course, there are risks to that. Like if you grow too fast, maybe it's unsustainable. You burn out your investors, you burn out your own social capital. What are some of the other moves you also consider in terms of like wrestling with competitors? Like what about on the technology side? What about on the customer side? I guess, yeah. Like what are some of these other ways that you can be faster?
So when we talk about Judo and competition, especially from a business perspective, I don't believe so much in being able to solve that on a short-term basis with technology. If you really want to outcompete the other person in terms of technology, you need at least 2 to 5 years for research to come up with something which they can build, or build something so deep that they can copy, right? Mm-hmm. So in my opinion is, when it's about competing with someone head to head and it's about speed, it's mostly decided on the business level, right?
I see. Makes sense. I want to sort of flip it a little bit. My last question is about like working with competitors. Like, have you had a collaborative relationship with a competitor that fits this profile? Is this even worth contemplating? Is this even possible? There is an existing, like I'm thinking like maybe, in the early days with PayPal, right? Like the combination with Elon Musk and like, what are some of the models that have worked for you if you've done this? Or like, what do you think are some of the models that you would actually explore to, another analogy I can think of is like in the game of Monopoly, right? Like if you're so keen on competing with everyone and you don't trade with anybody, you're going to lose in the end, right? You have to get ahead by working together and trading. even if some of the deals may be like not completely the best in one side. But like, I guess like, yeah, how do you think about working with competitors?
It's actually funny we are talking about competition here because I don't believe in competition. Why I don't believe in competition is because if you spend all your day thinking about the competition, you don't have enough time thinking about how to build a better company. And so for me, my biggest competition is myself. Am I able to surpass what I did last week, last month, last year? And that's my only competition. So most of my time when I do startup, I focus just on myself. Like, how can I outcompete myself? And when it's about working with others, everybody is a friend. Everybody is an opportunity for me to work together. So I don't consider necessarily someone else as a competition. I always reach out to all of the guys who do similar stuff, and I try to find a way to have a win-win situation where we both can work together. Because ultimately you have to see it this way, right? As a startup, because you're so small, it's always a team play. So how do you build a team? And the team is not just in your team. The team is also outside with founders, with other companies, with other employees in other companies. It's really about how do you know how to play it so well that ultimately long term, let's say like you're working with a larger corporate who is competing against you, or you're working with someone who is your size and competing against you. Like you never know. Maybe those guys gonna be your best friends and gonna acquire you one day.
Right.
and so like for me, that's why I believe there's no competition, right? Make sure that you work with all of them. Make sure that you find a way that they don't, like I worked with a lot of Chinese companies in the past where I fly over to meet with Huawei and with like, Oppo and stuff like that. And I always run the risk that they're going to rip me off my technology and being able to just replicate what I do.
Mm-hmm.
But, like I never saw it that way. I saw it as an opportunity. Like if they do and they find out they cannot reproduce what we do, because as a startup you have much more depth information about the user,
Mm-hmm.
then at some point they have to acquire you.
Right. That's a really great way to build an acquisition relationship, a good exit.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
I see. I think that's such a great mindset to have, to think about like win-win relationships with all of your competitors. What have that looked like in your experience? What are some of these win-win relationships?
That's a good question. I think there was a company which was doing 3D processing on a chip, right? So they wanted to build a chip right for that, and we were doing purely software, right? So we had to a certain degree chip dependencies, and they had to a certain degree software dependencies, but we were competing head to head because like both solutions ultimately should achieve the same goal, right? And for us, I went and met with them because I'm like, if someone is focused on chips, then his expertise are very different than ours. His team is very different than ours. So in a scenario like that, they must be struggling. Like that's my assumption, right? They must be struggling with software. They must be not as good on that side, and they're trying to solve it with the chip because they're better on the chip side and design side and hardware side. So I told them like, how about we combine our forces, and we're gonna optimize through our software how your chip is gonna be built, and you're gonna help us with your chip design, how our software is being processed.
That makes sense. Han, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a pleasure once again. For everyone watching, if you have any questions for Han, for the other founders, or you have questions about the topics we talked about, please add them to the comments below the video, and we'll see you next time.
Great to meet you all.